Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today in the shop we've got this beautiful Honda CH80 Elite that has suffered a catastrophic engine failure. So we're going to tear it down and see where it all went wrong. Let's get started. So, how do you know if you've suffered a catastrophic engine failure? Well, this customer said the scooter was consuming quite a bit of oil, and while they were out on a ride, it started making a lot of noise and started smoking a lot and finally shut down on them. Now, they were unable to restart it, so they towed it in here. And let me give you a little taste of what this engine sounds like now. Now this engine is turning over, but it doesn't really sound like there's a lot of compression. You don't really hear the pumping, boom, 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 as it cranks. The second thing is, if you listen closely, you can hear a little bit of clatter, a little clack, 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 every time the engine goes around. So we're gonna do a quick compression test, just to verify that this thing really isn't doing what it should. Check this out. Yeah, we're reading about 15 pounds of compression there. And this spark plug corroborates the story. It's covered in oil, it's black, there's a lot of deposits and buildup. This thing is really done. If I had to guess, I'd say the piston rings let go, and then we had a lot of crankcase oil getting up past the rings into the combustion chamber. But we won't know until we get there. So the first thing we need to do is yank this engine out of the chassis. We'll set it up on the workbench, tear it all down and inspect what needs to be replaced and what can be saved. Alright, so I've got the engine out of the CH80 here. I've left it mostly intact, one, because this is how you pull it out, and two, it kind of helps stabilize it. I've got it blocked up on a little homemade crib, and we're just going to go ahead and start tearing down the fan shroud assembly. You know, all of this is part of the cooling system. The air is drawn in through this little grate, so air enters here, it's expelled outward, and this ducting channels it over the cylinder head to keep it from overheating. So in order to get to the engine, we're first going to have to pull all that apart.
So everywhere except for America.
Yep.
Protection as well.
And it sucks, but it's true.
Plastics out of different metals and everything.
It'd be the perfect tool.
Right.
Okay, so I've got the fan shroud all off, and now you can see the cylinder head is clearly exposed here. The first thing we're going to need to do is pull off this valve cover and inspect the valve train. Now it is possible that this thing lost a valve or one of the valves worked itself loose in the head. Oil can get in past the valve seals if that happens. And of course a burned valve isn't going to allow you to build compression. So that's our first place to inspect. Alright, with the valve cover off, we can inspect the valve train. You've got your cute little timing chain here running the camshaft. The camshaft opens and closes the valves like so. We're going to set this engine at top dead center real quick and check the valve lash. There we go, that's top dead center. There's little marks here on the cam wheel. And we seem to have pretty normal valve lash. Of course, I'd have to check it with a feeler gauge to see if it's in spec, but I know that that amount of lash doesn't tell me that there's an issue with the valves. If a valve was bent, you'd have excessive lash on one side, or if it's burned, sometimes it'll be totally tight. So our next move is to keep disassembling this top end. We'll pull off the cam support and get into the cylinder head.
This is one of those situations where it's like,
We were talking about going down to Lockhart.
oh yeah, that weird little spot.
Yeah. Man, that is the cutest little camshaft.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Oh boy. You should see the lateral movement on it.
Oil starvation or what?
No, I just wore the rings right out. All right, so we've got the cylinder head off the engine here. And the head actually looks pretty good. There's no indications that anything has shaken loose and gouged the head. Although there is quite a bit of carbon deposit in the combustion chamber, the valves don't look like they're in bad shape. I bet this would clean up and relap nicely. Now it looks like the main source of our lack of compression is a worn out piston and cylinder. As this thing moves around in the cylinder bore, you can see the piston slopping back and forth, and there definitely is combustion leaking past those gaps into the crankcase, which is then pushing the oil and all the crankcase vapors up into the recirculator and ingesting it, and that's where the oil consumption was coming from too. So this thing might clean up with a top end rebuild, which would be a cylinder, a piston, wrist pin, gaskets, things like that. But we do want to keep going. We're going to go a little further and check the crank and the crank pin, crank bearings, just to make sure we don't have any bottom end damage. So let's keep going. All right, so we found something pretty dramatic under here. The piston has shattered, the skirts are completely gone. It might be because the piston slap was so extreme that the piston was able to rock back and forth in the bottom of the stroke and catch the connecting rod. This is not a good sign. But feeling the crank, I don't really have a whole lot of slop in that. And aside from this just blown to pieces wrist pin, I mean, this is like crazy. The connecting rod feels pretty good. So I think that we'll be able to save the connecting rod, reuse the crank. I don't think we'll have to split the cases and rebuild the bottom end, as long as we can get all these piston pieces out of it. But that's not our decision to make. This is the customer's bike after all, and whether or not they have a sentimental value on this engine or they just want to replace it with a known running used unit is their decision. So I guess that's what we'll sign off for today. All right, so we're in luck. This customer has decided to go ahead and overhaul this engine. Now that's pretty great, one, because it keeps this little piece of history out of the landfill, and it's also kind of a fun project for us because we like taking something non-running and turning it into something running. So we went ahead and ordered a new top end from Honda. So we ordered the cylinder, the piston, the gaskets, new wrist pin, all that good stuff. And we're gonna go ahead and see if we can fish out all those little pieces of piston inside the cases. We'll probably end up splitting the cases to get them all out. We've done a fair amount of cleaning. As you can see, it's a lot cleaner. This engine was actually silver, not black. So yeah, I guess we'll cut the time lapse. All right, so I got this front cover off the motor, the CH80, and we really lucked out because Honda's cut these big relief windows in for oil to pass through this cover into the crankcase. And if you look in this window here, you can see all those pieces of the piston. And it doesn't look like it's shattered into tiny little fragments. They seem to be pretty big pieces. So I'll definitely be able to fish those out of there, wash the case out, wash the bearings out, and get this top end back together. Okay, so I got really lucky there. I was able to get all the pieces that dropped down into the crankcase, both with some spray aerosol solvent, and then also I was using a pair of chopsticks to reach way in the back. Every good technician's got a set. So that was really great. I didn't have to split the cases, and we got it all cleaned out. So this is all ready to go back together. But then I moved on to decarbonizing the head, and this thing really was cleaning up great, but I did notice that the intake valve had some damage on the seating surface of the valve. That's probably from a piece of the piston bouncing around in the combustion chamber. So we had to put this whole project on hold again, so we got the intake valve in. But now I believe I've got every piece that I need to go back together, so let's get it going. All right, we're moving right along here. The next thing I need to do is lap the new intake valve into the head. What lapping valves is you put a little bit of valve lapping compound. It's basically a mild abrasive. And you install the valve into the head, like so. And you put a little bit of that compound here on the lip between the valve and the seat. And the old way to do it is you get this like suction cup tool and you stick it to the valve and you go back and forth like you're a Boy Scout trying to start a fire or something like that. And it works pretty good, but I feel, one, you don't really have a whole lot of control of the downward pressure, and also it takes a long time. I thought I'd share with you guys my trick for lapping valves. And I'm not claiming this, I didn't invent this. I learned this many, many years ago. But you take a handheld drill and you stick a little bit of fuel line in the end. Okay, and then you stick that on the end of the valve, just like so. And what that does is it allows you to rotate the valve with the drill. See that? I've got it on a slow speed, but it really works really great. Then with your finger, you apply a little bit of pressure. So that's your downward pressure into the seat, right there, your finger. But just a little bit of this, and you're pretty much done. Okay, back to the time lapse. Well, this is it. I'm saying my final goodbye to all these beautiful, shiny new pieces I've installed. Before I cover this whole thing back up with the fan shroud, it's kind of a shame that no one will ever see these beautiful pieces, but I know that I get to enjoy them, and luckily the owner is going to get to see this and see all the new beautiful parts on their engine. Anyway, I'm going to stuff this back in the chassis and fire her up for the first time. So, see you then. Alright, it is a very cold day here in Austin, Texas, as you can tell by the old jacket here. We've got the engine back in the CH80, and now it's time to fire it up and see if it's going to come back to life. This is a totally cold motor. You know, it's 32 degrees here today. All right, well, I am super stoked with that result. Engine fired right up and really ran great. We're gonna run it for a little bit longer and kind of let it heat cycle a couple times for that full break-in before we turn it back over to the customer. I hope they're gonna be excited to have this back. Before we put all the fan shrouds back on the engine and covered up all those brand new parts that we installed, I did leave a little mark to remember us by. I've got a little code on there, S911 for Scooter 911, GS, that's me, and 22 for 2022. So that way, if this bike ever gets serviced again, people will know this is the one that we did overhaul. And anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our updates on any of our projects or any videos like this. Ring that notification bell, of course. Until I see you next time, keep it shiny side up.